The sides in the conflict, the worldviews of humanism and Christianity, can be represented by two castles. The castle of humanism is built on the denial of God and the evolutionary justification of that denial. That of Christianity is built on God as the sovereign creator of all things and God's historic revelation of himself since the beginning of time. The enemies of God know that if you can take out the foundational belief in God and his revelation on which the Christian castle is built, the castle will fall. This opposition's been in progress since the fall, and though suicidal and self-refuting, has had great success. Over the last 150 years or so, it's transformed Western culture, which was once broadly Christian, to being now almost totally pagan, secular. Even most Christians are highly secularized and in self-imposed confinement behind the invisible walls of a Christian ghetto, intellectually products of humanistic state education systems, no longer even knowing what a Christian culture would look like. Some Christians have been active, fighting some issues which certainly need to be fought: abortion, pornography, homosexuality, injustice, etc. Only these are the fruit, not the root of the problem. Or fighting each other. Though I have to say that while not many hills are worth dying for, some need to be defended with all our might. Others perhaps have been asleep on the rear turrets, oblivious to the war raging around them. There's nothing redeemable about this. Being asleep in a battle is treason. Maybe they've been seduced by the seemingly all-pervasive godless entertainment provided in our time, failing to discern the destructive and corrupting worldview presented through many films, much popular music, and the arts. Perhaps they just like personal peace and comfort and prefer to hide away from the fray. These are not the sort of people you want guarding your back in a firefight. Others, perhaps with a hoot and a holler, shoot into space and do their religious thing in any of a number of ghetto groupie ways, totally irrelevant in the conflict, but thinking they're being effective in the war. There may even be a fifth column inside the church blowing up our own foundation and seeking to replace it with humanistic foundations. Primarily, however, I think that what's happened is that Christians have withdrawn from the battle. They've retreated over the drawbridge, pulled down the portcullis, and occupied themselves with the internal workings of the castle, convincing themselves that castle matters are on a higher plane, a more important level than those outside the walls. The population of the castle is maintained by inbreeding, rather than conversion to the king and the kingdom. Many also wait for the king to ride in, scatter their enemies, and bail them out of their besieged state. It's time we began defensively protecting and defending our own foundations and offensively training our guns on the foundations of the enemy, the atheism and its evolutionary justification. To change the illustration, if we take out the root of humanism, we take out the fruit as well, whereas if we only take out the fruit, it will come again because the root has not been destroyed. If we only go for the fruit, the war will be for us a constant retreat. In spite of what some are loudly claiming today, retreat has been the history of Christianity in the West for the past 150 years, to the point where most Western countries are almost totally secularized. In this war, the humanists have understood the issues much more clearly than most Christians. We need to do our homework. We need to instruct ourselves in the biblical worldview. We can't rely on our church to train us. In my experience, sadly, most churches do not train their people in the biblical worldview for either a defensive or an offensive role. If we have any say in the matter, we should endeavour to see our churches are equipped. But individually, we should make sure we equip our families, those we're responsible for, our children, if or when we have them, so they're not intimidated or seduced by the God-denying, God-excluding, God-hating worldview that surrounds us on every hand.
The basic problem of the Christians in this country in the last 80 years or so, in regard to society and in regard to government, is that they have seen things in bits and pieces. instead of totals.
The thoughts we have in our heads can be compared to a collection of individual pieces of a jigsaw. A jigsaw may have individual pieces scattered around, disconnected and confusing. Or the puzzle may have been solved, the pieces put together, and as a result a coherent picture has emerged from the formerly unconnected bits. When a jigsaw is scattered, it doesn't make sense. When it's put together, it does. If we don't understand how to put the jigsaw in our head together, or if we fail for whatever reason to put the pieces together, we'll have no clear picture or insight into what's happening around us, nor a coherent understanding on which to base a response. Francis Schaeffer was speaking of evangelical Christians in America in the 1980s. But I don't think the problem was or is confined to one country, one point in time, or for that matter to any one group of Christians or group of people in general. The problem as we now face it is a product of the modern age and affects at least all Western countries, the one I'm most familiar with being my home country of New Zealand. I think it explains why the church and Christian influence in general is going backwards, and has been doing so for a long time. This despite much talk in church circles about victory, bold claims that the church is going ahead, and endless large Christian events heralded with fanfare and razzmatazz. And also despite global statistics showing massive church growth. To be frank, I'm suspicious of church growth statistics from anywhere in the world. It's hard enough to get accurate figures regarding anything in a country like my own, which has official and scrupulous statistic gathering bodies. And then, once you have the figures, what do they mean? Church growth stats out of Africa or wherever from partisan Christian NGOs sound to me like an exercise in wishful thinking to either justify an unwarranted triumphalism or aid in fundraising. I will remember answering a leader's evaluation form at a youth camp I attended years ago. In the euphoria at the end of the camp, I said it was the best camp I'd been to. However, after several weeks of more sober reflection, I came to realise it was, for a number of reasons, one of the worst I'd attended. And yet my more sober reflection did not register in the statistics of the camp. The impact of Christianity on the present New Zealand community, and in particular on the formative areas of society, that is the media, the education system, civil government, the judiciary and the arts, is practically zero. In fact, I'm not convinced that modern evangelical Christianity from anywhere in the world has much to offer these areas at the moment, given the apparent paucity of thinking in its circles regarding the biblical view of law, government, overall social structure, and civil institutions. The society of which I'm a part is not what it used to be. I'm thinking here of ethical, moral differences rather than technological or other differences. Crime statistics are one measure of the ethical changes that have occurred. Many people are justifiably concerned about a rising tide of violence. Murders when I was a kid were 3 or 4 a year, that's what it seemed like, if that, and occupied the attention of the country for weeks. Now they're every other day, and the only ones that make the headlines are those that catch the fancy of the media because of some outstanding feature or quirky twist they consider newsworthy. The violation of women of all ages through rape has increased in a similar way. Not even baby girls or women in their 80s are exempt from this, with sickening examples of these being reported. Many people never used to lock their doors when they went out, or even when they went on holiday. They had no need to. People, by and large, were honest and respected the property of others. Now it's not just locks on doors, but on windows also, and alarms as well. I imagine many people in cities make sure they lock their doors when they're home, so no unwelcome visitors can walk in uninvited. We do. Paranoid? Perhaps. Cautious? Definitely. Other things also indicate the ethical shift that's been going on. The abortion rate was stable at around 25 per year for decades, and these were the extreme cases where a mother's physical life was genuinely in danger from her pregnancy, and the medical technology of the time couldn't help. Medical advances over the past few decades have slashed the need for such a choice to be made between mother and child. However, since 1973, the annual abortion rate has steadily increased, with the annual rates in the years 2005 to 2010, fluctuating around 17,500. 17,500 unborn babies killed as a result of a lifestyle choice of their parents and discarded like so much worthless trash. Prior to 1960, the rate of those born outside of marriage in the European population of New Zealand, I understand, was stable at around 3% of live births. In 1968, it was 11% in the European population and 28% in the Maori population. In 2008, those figures had apparently jumped so that in the European population, it was 35% and 78% in the Maori population. Increasing couples simply dispense with marriage. Here's a graph from the US Centers for Disease Control showing some first world countries' illegitimacy rates in the years 1980 to 2007. It indicates clearly that an ethical change has been occurring. New Zealand government has a welfare payment paid mostly to solo mothers called the Domestic Purposes Benefit. In 1974, when it was introduced, there were around 12,600 people receiving it, with total payments amounting to some $30 million. In 2010, those numbers had climbed, I understand, from 12,600 to 97,000, and the total cost from $30 million to around $1.2 billion. Once homosexual behaviour was outlawed and understood to be perversion and abhorred. Now it's promoted to children in public schools, and moves are afoot to halt any spoken opposition to it by means of hate speech laws. Prostitution was decriminalised in 2005 by the New Zealand Parliament and legitimised as a valid service industry on a par with building, nursing or serving at McDonald's. In 2007, the New Zealand Parliament repealed a long-standing law which had legitimised parental use of reasonable force to correct children. The repeal was despite consistent opposition from over 80% of the population. With discipline breaking down all over the country, Parliament stepped in and insisted on throwing petrol on the fire to increase the lack of discipline. A non-binding referendum held to get Parliament to reverse its decision returned 87% against the legislation, but was dismissed out of hand by the Prime Minister, clearly for ideological reasons. Many other illustrations could be given, and no doubt people from other Western countries could document such changes having occurred in their home countries over the past few decades. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Besides anything else, the economic and social costs of many of these ethical changes are staggering. Why have these changes occurred? Thinking of New Zealand, why were people generally more honest, less violent 50 years ago than they are today? Why have sexual perversions, a most un-PC term in today's world, been accepted as normal such that they can be promoted to children in schools? Is it because of some undefined, elusive cause which none have been able to identify? I don't think so. The cause has been known for a long time and has been spelt out by people more profound than myself. The reason is that ideas have consequences. In other words, what a person believes will by and large determine how that person will act. And the ideas that dominate within a society are what determine the actions of people within that society. What we see clearly today are plenty of actions, that is, consequences that flow from ideas. What we may not see so clearly are the ideas that have gone before the actions or consequences, and from which they flow. Now, I'm not thinking here of ideas that come immediately before the actions, but of what can be called the cultural, philosophical, religious environment that went before them, and was the seedbed, as it were, for the specific thoughts and moral judgments that led to the actions. So, people in general used to act in other ways in the past in New Zealand. What were the ideas that gave rise to those actions? What ideas were believed in the past that formed the cultural, philosophical, religious environment of the past and produced the actions of the past, the greater personal honesty, the respect for property and life, and belief in and respect for marriage, and the rejection of perversion? It shouldn't be thought I'm suggesting there was a golden age in the past where everything was all sweetness and light. There was no such golden age. However, there was an age when different ethics were held and lived by. In contrast to the ideas held in the past, what ideas dominate today and produce the actions of today? The ongoing devaluation of marriage and the raising of de facto and homosexual liaisons to almost its equivalent as a result of parliamentary action. The increasing disregard for the value of life seen in the state-endorsed, funded and provided abortion industry, and the rise in serious violent crime. The increasing dishonesty at the personal, the business and the public level, and the stripping away from parents of their authority to correct their children. When we see changes like these, we need to ask, what has been happening at the level of ideas? I've found the most helpful way to get a handle on this is to think in terms of what are called worldviews.